Adobe issued a major update to a number of its applications in October 2024, but although there are some cool features that are added to some of these programs, there are also a lot of bugs that came along with it. So in this episode, I'm going to show not just some of the new features and things you can start doing with Photoshop and Lightroom Classic and also Adobe Camera Raw. I'm going to show also where it's failing, where there are still some bugs. Now, this release seems like it was rushed for their Max event because of all the bugs, and in addition to that, there were so many bugs that 2 days later, Adobe issued yet another update, for instance, to Lightroom Classic. So Lightroom Classic, the initial update for October 2024 was version 14. This is going to be on version 14.0.1. Also, Photoshop will be version 26, and Adobe Camera Raw, which very impressive, some of the stuff that's put in there, that will be Adobe Camera Raw version 17. So now let's dive into these applications to see what is new, what is broken, and also what's pretty cool. So let's dive into Lightroom Classic first. This has more of the problems than the other applications, and at the same time, unfortunately, it has fewer new additions and not so much cool stuff. We're going to see some really great stuff though as we work through and get to Photoshop and Adobe Camera Raw throughout this video. Now I'm going to concentrate on some of the more salient features because there were other features. In fact, you can go to the What's New in Lightroom Classic page, and I'll have a link to this also down in the description for this video. And in there then they'll show their various features. You can see up here that they already had to update it to 14.0.1 because of the various bug fixes, and there's still more to go. And so here we can see though the various additions that they've done. They remove distractions, secure digital assets. A lot of this stuff is kind of cool, and I'm going to cover a little bit of this, but some of this really isn't all that new, like remove distractions. Well, we've already had the generative remove inside of Lightroom Classic before. We already had the denoise feature. It's just a little bit different now with other types of RAW files, other camera supports, a little bit better tethering. Those things are kind of cool, and if you want to dive into that, definitely feel free to go over to this page, once again, linked down in the description, and check these out for yourself. But what I want to really do is concentrate first on some of the problems, and then one of the features here that I think is really cool. Then, of course, we'll get into some more fun stuff when we get into Photoshop and Adobe Camera Raw. But first off, when you do an update here for this new October 2024 update of Lightroom Classic, you are going to need to update your catalogs. Now you'll get a prompt that'll look like this as you're doing your updates, and it'll say that it needs to upgrade to the latest catalog. And of course, this is something that you have to do, you should do, because there's going to be more information stored in these catalogs. But there is a problem, and that's that every time there's a major change to the catalogs, to the settings, all that, well, there's inevitably going to be some bugs from some legacy stuff. And so what I found a problem that dealt with copy and paste on settings. There is a way to fix it though. Other people were finding various things were just wonky, and what happens is the settings and the catalog, all these changes just seems to confuse the heck out of Lightroom Classic, and a lot of that I think they could avoid if they just didn't have this crazy cataloging system that they have. Anyways, the problem that I had, for instance, was that to finish an image, you know, that I might be applying, if you've seen my other videos on doing flambient or HDR, that I'm going to be doing some settings. I might apply like a preset to here, and then I'd right click on that and I'd say develop settings, and then I'd copy those settings because I can copy those and paste those to other images that I might want to then have this applied and then do other adjustments to it instead of using sync. In either case, normally what I would do is I would go to develop settings and then I could paste those settings. Or you could also do those with keyboard shortcuts, and you could do that also from the menu, copy settings, paste settings, Control-Shift-C, Control-Shift-V. The problem was this wasn't working all the time. And it was just crazy. It's like no matter what I tried on copying and pasting settings, whether I did it by right-clicking on an image, whether I did it from the menu, whether I did it with shortcut keys, it just was intermittently working. Now, you might see some other issues like that where something just doesn't seem to make sense. Well, there is a way to fix this, whether it's this update or any update at all, and that's that you're going to have to reset your preferences, and this is how you do it. What you do is you go up to the Edit menu, and you go to Preferences. Then you want to go to your General tab. And while you're in here, hold down your Alt key if you're on Windows or Option if you're on a Mac. And when you do, you'll see some of these other buttons down here. And what you can do then while you're holding that Alt or Option key down is click on Reset All Preferences and Relaunch. Now, I did that and then I still had to relaunch Lightroom Classic myself. It was that buggy. But when you do, it's going to clear all this stuff out. You're going to clear out every preference that you set. And so you're going to need to come back in. You'll see things start working better, or they should start working better. But when you do, there's a few things that you definitely need to change. And one of the things that you should change is when it comes to external editing. And this is something that when you're going back and forth between Lightroom Classic and Photoshop, it needs to know how to handle the file. So it should be in the format TIFF, it should be color space sRGB, bit depth 16, but what will change, you want your resolution to be 300, and most importantly, you want this compression to be none. It will default to zip, and that is super time consuming. That is just a thing that they should not have here in Lightroom Classic at all. They just shouldn't really have that. They tried to speed things up by having zip compression in the TIFF. They've always done a poor job with that. And so you might have seen in other videos, or if you've taken my courses, you've seen in my books, I talk, just set this to none. You'll thank yourself later. So anyways, once you do change your settings, go back here, make sure this is set. So besides that too, you'll probably have to change your export settings. So once again, just a recap on that, if we were to go to File, and then we were to go to Export, in the Export dialog, you might have to change things. For instance, like if you have a favorite subfolder that you're used to using, some of your settings for exporting out JPEGs, then you'd want to change this as well. Now, while we're in export, it's neat to know here that we've got this new feature. Notice here we've got this new section called Content Credentials. This is something that came out since AI became really popular, that has been something Adobe has been pushing, and so have a lot of other companies, where you can include your content credentials. And if you're not familiar with that, you can go to contentcredentials.org and you can learn more about what that really is. And that's a way of putting in some encrypted information inside of your exported JPEGs so that you can have your information and also kind of a breadcrumb trail of what was done. Does it create any AI? Was AI used in any portion of it? Were you really the content creator? It's not the EXIF information that's in there. What this is actually embedded, encrypted information that really is difficult to get rid of. So anyways, in Lightroom Classic, you can now include that. Now, this is starting to come out into a lot of other applications that they have, and it will, in more time, have more options and be more widely available. But what you can do is you can say that you want to attach it to the files. They have a way to publish it to the cloud. I think that's kind of silly. That's easy to work around. But you attach it to your files, it will make the file size larger, but your content credentials would be there. And then I can see that, oh, here's my producer. And then if I needed to, any edits and activity that was in there. But what is disappointing is that there were a lot more features put into Adobe Camera Raw in this release than Lightroom Classic, which doesn't really make a lot of sense because Adobe Camera Raw is basically Lightroom Classic. So I'm going to get to Adobe Camera Raw here shortly, but next, let's move over to Photoshop. And like with Lightroom Classic, there are a lot of additions and features and whatnot, some bug fixes, and I'll have a link to the What's New page for Photoshop down in the description also. But here I'm going to cover the big major ones. And you can see that here in their What's New in Photoshop page. And they have down here where they've added then this improved generative fill by, as they state, adding the latest Adobe FireFly image model. And this is something I've got an issue with because I'm not really seeing it in all instances. I think they might have overlooked that. So let's dive into that. If I were to generate an image, then it does seem to be using Adobe FireFly 3. For instance, in Adobe FireFly 3, we've got a higher resolution image than the 2 model, which allows me to be more than just 1K big. So this image is 2688 by 1536, and that's what you'd get out of FireFly on the web app if you were to use that. This was using the generate image feature, which you would just have, let's say, a blank document here, and I just did it to that size. And then what you can do is you can go up to edit, and then you'd go to generate image, and then you can type in whatever you'd like. What I did here in this case, I can go back to my properties here, and I typed in a modern luxury house in the style of Frank Lloyd Wright sitting on a hill overlooking a city. And of course then I've got all my various choices on what I'd like to choose from. So that all seems to be working fine. I zoom in 100% and it's, Adobe FireFly, it's okay. It's not really grainy, it's decent quality. But when I use other features of AI in Photoshop 26, it doesn't seem that FireFly 3 is working. So this and the remove tool are very bizarre. And I'm gonna get to the remove tool next because there were some major changes. But going back here real quick to this generative fill and generative expand, things that would be attached to the FireFly model don't seem to really be using 3. Here's an example. Let's zoom out here on this image and let's just expand it a little bit. And I'm not going to do generative expand, I'll just do this so we can do it in pieces to see what's going on. So what you can do is go up to image and we'll go to canvas size. I'm going to increase the canvas size by 2000 pixels, which I should be able to do if this is using FireFly 3, and then I'm going to constrain it to the left. Now with that then, when I say okay, I've got this area here that I can add something to. So this is where I'd like to do some generative fill. And it'd be the same thing basically do an expand as well, but here's a really good test because what I can do is, and you've probably seen me do this in another video, I've got a link to that also, where you can do this in pieces. And I'm going to take the marquee tool and I'm going to set it to a fixed size. And the fixed size I'm going to use is, as though it were FireFly 2, it would be a maximum resolution of 1000 pixels, meaning that when I put my marquee tool here, you can see that's 1000 pixels square. If I go down here into this little section right there, and then I were to go to edit and then generative fill and just leave that blank, let it go ahead and fill in, then I'm going to get that area filled in. Now, once again, this is 1000 pixel square, so we're going to be able to see what the resolution is when we compare this then to what's supposed to be in FireFly 3 in Photoshop 26. Now I'll move this off to the side, we'll zoom in 100%, and as we move over here, then we can see that that looks pretty good. Now I'm not really happy with the choices it put in there. That might be a little bit better or whatnot, but no matter what we do when we look at it, we can see that there really is no noticeable dividing line. So everything looks like it's high resolution. So that maintained, this is exactly what I would expect if I was using FireFly 2. But if I'm using FireFly 3, I should be able to use a 2000 pixel square, meaning I've got this higher resolution. So instead of 1024, I should go up to 2048, but I'll just go to 2024, even be a little bit more lenient with it. So I'll go and do that, 2000 square, and now I'll take the marquee tool, and you can see I've got a much bigger square. Let's get that same area here and let's do a generative fill once again. Won't type anything in, just click generate and let it do its thing. And once it's done, we can now go here, we'll zoom in to 100% and see how this looks. Now we've got a few different variations here that we can choose from, which is fine. I'm not happy with necessarily all of them. We'll just use the first one here. But now, when I turn this off and on, you can see there's a noticeable resolution difference. You can see where the line is definitely here, especially down in these plants that are on the hillside. This is just highly pixelated. It's really not that good. Yeah, it might be 2000 pixels. I really doubt it. All this just looks fuzzy. It looks like it was done maybe out of FireFly 2 and then just expanded. So really not impressed, not nearly the same results. Look at this over here, this line right here. I'm gonna turn this on and off and just look how awful that line is. It's blurry here, and one of the reasons being is that they're feathering it. You can see there's a feathering that they're going on here. And I get the idea why they would do that, but the way they're doing it just is making things worse. Which brings up the next bug, and that's that if we were to enhance this, which there's a feature on all these icons here for doing the generative fill. There's that little icon. If I click on that to enhance details, it crashed on me every single time. So while this is not that great a quality, I'd think, well, I could just go in here and say enhance details and that would be great. But every time I tried it, my entire Photoshop crashed. But let's back out of here. Let's just go back up here and just work with this particular image. Now, we'll take a look next at another AI feature, which is their new improved remove tool. So I've got that selected over here, and as you can see, there's some new features. If we go up here to the top, they have a thing called Find Distractions, and I'm going to cover that next, but they also have this mode here, which is new, and you could have it set to auto, which is its default. You can use generative AI on. I would recommend, for the most part, keeping that off. There really is very little benefit. I'm going to show you an example here as to why. So let's say that we wanted to remove this now open sign over here. So let's zoom in here a little bit. And if I were to remove this just using the standard old remove tool, so generative AI is off, and I'm going to then just draw right around here. I'm going to make sure it catches the shadow. It closed it just fine. Now I don't have remove after each stroke enabled. I like to leave that off anyways. You might have seen that in other videos. And now I'll just click the checkbox. Now this has taken a lot longer in some of the instances to do. This went fairly quick, but it didn't even pop up the progress bar for doing it. And sometimes it would take a long time. But you can see here, it didn't really do the greatest job. So you'd think, well, let's do that with doing then maybe with the generative AI on. So let's back out of here. And to really show the difference on this, what I'm going to do is put this on a separate layer. So what I'm going to first do is I'm going to go up to layer and just new layer. And I'm just going to name this one. I'll name this repair, so we can keep it separate. Now with sample all layers selected, anything I do here is going to show up on that layer using the remove tool. So anyways, let's go to the generative AI on, and this will then, as I'm using the remove tool, once I'm done and I apply it, it'll do a generative AI on it instead. So now I'll click that little check mark and let it do its generative AI. Now it's removing the area and removing the area. And there it goes. Okay, did a good job, did take a while, but that's okay. Now I do like it. If we turn this layer on and off, we can see that did a really good job. That also cost me a generative credit. On top of that, I don't really have any choices. So if I don't like the results that came out of this, well, I'm kind of stuck. I don't really have a choice. So instead of doing this, if I'm going to spend a generative credit on that, let's shut this off and let's use just generative fill. So I'll make a new layer, new layer, just like we did before. I'll call this one Gen Fill, like that. And then we'll do a generative fill. So I'll use the polygon tool and I'll just go around that sign and some of the shadows. So we'll do that, close it up, and now let's go to Edit and we'll go to Generative Fill. And now I can just click Generate. Let it go out, do its thing, and when it's done, it looks pretty good. Now we can compare the differences here. If I go down here to my layers and I click on this was with the repair, this is with Gen Fill, and you might think, well, that's fine, but the nice thing is by using Gen Fill and using the same amount of generative credits, I have 3 choices that I can select from to see which one I like the best. For instance, I do like that. Probably a little bit better over here, but either way, I have choices and I can then regenerate it, and I can regenerate it with also a prompt. So the idea of this being in the remove tool to me doesn't make any sense. If I'm going to be using generative credits, then I might as well get the same result using something that's a lot more flexible. But now let's move on to the other features of the remove tool, that distraction stuff. Let's take a close look at that. Here's one of my grandkids, and it's an AI picture that was based off of this. When Grandpa was out there at one of his soccer games and caught him running, so I used that to then make this. Anyways, if I were to take this image and I wanted to remove some of the distracting features out of the background, I could use the remove tool, but there's also then a feature when I select that to find distractions. Now, once again, I've got the feature of AI off or AI on, and in this case, we'll just use AI on. And find distractions, I can find wires and cables, or in this case, people. When I click on people, it goes through, analyzes, and found, hey, there's some people here. Now, I could have just as easily just brushed over it, but hey, that's fine, it's there. And if I click OK on this, then it'll remove those people. And it did, but it just left some more junk in there. So to me, it didn't really do anything that I'd be super happy with. So to me, not really a great feature. If I were to just use the standard remove tool, it might have done better just by brushing it. To find people, I can see where people are. I don't need Photoshop to tell me where they are. So the other thing too though, if I were to use, for instance here, to try to remove this, if I were to use, not the distractions, they're not listed here, it's not going to find it. But if I were to use generative AI on, and let's say that I wanted to just remove this back thing here. So it's kind of like a sign thing they had for the soccer teams out there, advertising what they are. So I've got that all selected and I've got generative AI on. If I select OK and I click that, sure enough, it removed it. And by the way, I did cut the video, but it took almost a minute for that to complete. Something I just would not be using in my standard workflow. So this did an okay job. It's not that bad, but could I have done generative fill? Yeah, I could have done that. So did I really need to do this? Probably gets me the same result, just like when we were working with our building over here and getting the same result. So I didn't really find any benefit to really using the new feature, especially for these various distractions. So with that aside, let's now dive into Adobe Camera Raw because there's some really cool stuff. So using Adobe Camera Raw, and I'm not talking about Camera Raw filter, this Adobe Camera Raw, you can do that from Bridge or you can do it by opening a RAW file in Photoshop. I've got a RAW file here though in Bridge and I can open that in Camera Raw. For instance, I could just right click on that image and say open in Camera Raw. Now to see some of these new features that I'm going to show you here, there is something you have to do first. You have to go over to the settings over here, open up this preferences dialog, and there's going to be a section called technology previews. You need to have this checked. Why? I don't know. And then even after you do it and you say okay, you're going to have to restart Bridge or Photoshop or whatever it is you were using to open Camera Raw. I'll just hit cancel. I've already done that. So anyways, once you have that set, you can see some of these new features. So the first thing is an adaptive profile that's in beta. Go up here in the treatment profile, you might be familiar with this. This is where you can set different profiles that would match maybe your camera and how your camera on its matching profiles, for instance, I use the standard profile here on this one. So when I was taking all my shots, this pretty much matches what the RAW file would decode on my camera or in the OEM software, so that Lightroom Classic can also know how to debayer/decode the RAW file. So this looks pretty good, and I like the colors of this. This is the old-fashioned way of doing it. There's a new profile though up here that is the Adaptive Beta. So if you were to select Adobe Adaptive Beta, it's going to apply its own AI to that, and this is what it came up with. Now, you can see that the colors did change quite a bit. Now, it brought up shadows, it definitely made more contrast without changing any of the sliders that we have in Adobe Camera Raw. But once again, the colors are not accurate. If we go back to where we were, this is what I was expecting for the colors across the sky. When I apply the adaptive preset here, it just doesn't have the same colors. Now, yes, I could go through and change the colors myself, but when I get to that point, it's just not worth it. It's no longer a convenience tool. I could just apply my own preset to this, have the true colors that I'm looking for, and then up the shadows myself. Another cool feature that they have now in Adobe Camera Raw is, just like they have in Photoshop, they've got Generative Expand. So now if you were in Adobe Camera Raw and you go to the crop tool, now once again, this is Adobe Camera Raw, not Camera Raw Filter. This isn't available in Camera Raw Filter. You will see then this Enable Expand checkbox. Once again, you have to do that Enable Technology Previews I showed earlier. When you do, you'll see this. When you click on that, you can then expand it. So let's say we wanted to expand this image. So we'll expand it out to this far right here, and then just say Generate. Once it does its thing, where it's going to now do its generative expand, we can zoom in 100% and see if it did a good enough job. So at first glance, it looks pretty good. But once we zoom in though to 100% and we start moving around, that's when we can see how it really worked. So you can see almost immediately where it cut off because it's just got that low resolution. So just like I was showing before in Photoshop, really, you're using FireFly 3 Adobe? I don't think so. I mean, this just looks awful. I didn't expand it that far, and the results are just terrible. From a distance, it looks okay, but as soon as you get in close, well, that just falls apart. There is nothing sharp about this, and I didn't expand it that much. So really not a fan of this. It's something that, once again, you could do in Photoshop, and you could have a lot more control doing it in pieces. The next thing that I wanted to touch on was in Adobe Camera Raw, they have the ability now under the detail section down over here, you can do in detail, you can do denoise, raw details, and super resolution. Now, if you're not familiar with super resolution, that's pretty cool. It'll basically double the width, double the height. It does a pretty good job, actually. That's been around for a while in Lightroom Classic. And it was actually in Camera Raw where you would be able to click on the 3 dots up here and you'd have that option. But they moved it and now I can't batch it if I wanted to do that type of super resolution. I could do it across multiple images if I wanted to. Anyways, they moved it here and also with the ability to then improve raw details. So I could improve the raw details on this. It's gonna go out and do its thing, and there's really no noise here. This was on a tripod, and it was just a low ISO anyways. But you can see I can still do denoise, and I can still do super resolution. So I could do denoise on this also if I needed to, where before these things were separate. But it's something that I really wouldn't advise you to do. Why? Because I already cut the video once and that was after 2 minutes and the progress is still enhancing. A lot of this stuff that came out in this October release, when it comes to AI and some of their enhancement software, it's just too slow. It's just too cumbersome. Anyways, I'll just cancel out of this. But I can still do these other features in combination. But when it comes to the bug fixes, hopefully Adobe is going to be addressing a lot of this stuff. Once again, I think a lot of this was rushed to get it out to market. But as new features come out, improvements come out also, then I will take a look at it. I will keep you posted.